Professor Lee Changmin, hello. We are very pleased and grateful to have you on our podcast.
Hello, Fang Fei. I'm very happy to be on your show and to meet your audience.
Lately, the situation in Iran has been the focus of everyone's attention. The latest development is that the U.S. and Iran will hold negotiations in Pakistan. Today is Friday, Eastern Time in the U.S., and tomorrow, Saturday in Pakistan, they will begin the talks. I'd like to ask you first, just a couple of days ago, we saw Trump on his Truth Social threatening Iran, saying he would bomb them back to the Stone Age if they didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz by a certain deadline. So what happened then? All of a sudden, there was a dramatic reversal, and the US and Iran announced a 2-week ceasefire. But in fact, the Strait of Hormuz still hasn't been fully reopened. Even Trump himself has admitted this. So in your view, I'd like to ask you first, Iran agreed to sit down for negotiations. Does this have anything to do with Trump's threats to bomb their power plants, bridges, and so on, this kind of ultimatum?
Yes, there is some connection, but I don't think it's very significant because if maximum pressure, meaning bombing you back to the Stone Age, really worked from the American perspective, worked means you have to surrender. At the very least, you have to first unconditionally reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. always feels that you have to admit defeat. But when Trump actually proposed this maximum pressure, he was very specific about the targets like bridges and especially your oil refining facilities and other infrastructure, so specific, and that's really frightening. If you hit the economy like that, it really would be sent back to the Stone Age. But what's strange to everyone is that Iran didn't surrender. It just kept holding out stubbornly. I think even Trump and his team didn't really expect that at first. So a couple of days ago, I wrote something about this. I said that, in fact, maybe they really don't quite understand how an authoritarian system works. It's different from a democracy. For example, if you have a democratic government and you say, I'm going to wipe out all of your people's livelihoods, then of course I would immediately have to figure out a way, because otherwise I wouldn't have any votes left. To put it plainly, without votes, and to put it more seriously, there could be a revolution and I'd be overthrown, right? But that's not how the logic works in an authoritarian regime. What do the people mean to them? In their eyes, the people are just leeks to be harvested. I mean, they've already opened fire and killed their own people, killed thousands upon thousands. Even if you destroy its entire economy and push it back to the Stone Age, it will still continue to rule because for them, their lifeline is holding on to power, not the state of the national economy. When we look at this specific point in time, it is my personal belief that, of course, we can't get into the inner workings of the Trump campaign team to see what they're really thinking. But from the outside, it does seem like he has not yet quite managed to figure this whole situation out. Right? In Chinese, we say that if you want to strike a snake, you have to hit its vital spot, right? You have to find its fatal pressure point. Only by hitting that can you truly bring it down. Iran, for example, is not a democratic country. It's like a primitive hairy ape that hasn't evolved. You can't even find a place to shave it, let alone locate its pressure points. How are you supposed to strike its vital spot? Exactly, that's the limit here. In reality, it's just not hitting the right spot at all. That's exactly it.
So what you mean is when he threatens to attack power plants or bridges and things like that, if he really does that, many people say it would cause a humanitarian disaster. For example, if there's no electricity, then there would be no water either. And in fact, the ones who would suffer the most, who would be hit the hardest, would actually be the Iranian people. Of course, Iran's economy would also take a huge blow. But for those dictators and those in power, like the Revolutionary Guard and so on, for these mullahs, do you think that actually for them it wouldn't be too big of a blow? Maybe they would still have electricity, they have backup generators.
Even if they don't have backup generators, it's still extremely difficult for an authoritarian regime to fall because of economic problems. They don't care about people's lives or deaths. Think about it. Even back in 2017 or 2018, when the United States started the trade war, Wang Qishan from China said, "We Chinese can survive for years just eating grass." Could you do that? He treats the people as if they can survive on grass, and he even says it proudly. Would the United States dare to say something like that? In any democracy, you wouldn't even think of saying something like that. You'd be finished immediately, right? So trying to use the economy to eliminate a totalitarian state, well, that just doesn't work. You're right. What you said makes a lot of sense. As for Iran, the calculations of this Iranian regime are actually quite simple. They say, if you bomb our power plants, if you attack our infrastructure and people's livelihoods, then you'll be labeled a war criminal by the international community. Right? Well, Trump, or really any government, would have to consider this issue. So in the end, he really was caught in a dilemma. Either you can't take them down, and then, of course, anti-war people in the U.S. will say, look, you failed. You backed down again. In my opinion, this time backing down was a wise choice. He couldn't just go ahead. Otherwise, it would be devastation for the people, even if you tried to avoid harming civilians. If you destroy their national economy, their water sources, their freshwater purification systems, their oil and their bridges, these are all related to civilian infrastructure, not just military. In fact, they are even more important for civilians. But if you really do that, you'll definitely be accused of committing crimes. Yes, you...
Now that you mention it, I do honestly think this is a very real and serious issue. Back when Donald Trump first threatened to strike Iran's critical power plants, I didn't really understand the strategy behind it. I often wondered to myself, why on earth would he want to attack those specific power plants? A lot of people told me, well, if there's no electricity, then their military, the Iranian regime, or the communication between the Revolutionary Guard, or even their high-level command chain would break down. They say that this could deal a particularly heavy blow to the regime, but in reality, that might not actually be the case. In fact, if you attack power plants, the greater impact is on the country's people and its economy. But for those in power, for the ruling dictatorship, it might not affect them that much. I think they probably really do have their own ways. I believe they won't go without food or water.
Actually, for a dictatorship, the times they are most effective and thrive are during periods of hardship. Look at when the Chinese Communist Party was seizing power. Those were extremely tough times, but they weren't afraid. Of course, once they had money and peace, that's when corruption started to set in. That's why Mao Zedong said, we must beware of sugar-coated bullets. What are they afraid of? The harder things get, the less they fear. And there's another point as well. There's a difference between Iran and Venezuela. Iran is not a secular government. What is its ideology? Its ideology is that people live to serve Allah, to serve God, right? They say that dying is an honor and that when you die, you'll get 72 virgins and all sorts of nonsense like that. They use this as a guiding principle. So their view of death is truly different from that of ordinary people. You have to admit that. They believe that to a certain extent, they don't see death as something to be feared. Death means serving Allah, and that's considered a great honor. So now they have even more reason to say, look, the United States is making us do this. They're forcing us to act this way. That's why they're so hardline, so uncompromising. Of course, I'm not saying they're not afraid of death. Now, all these leaders are in hiding. They're not using phones or anything like that. Of course, they are afraid of death. But their view on death, in terms of ideological propaganda, is quite unique. There really is a difference between them and secular governments.
There's one thing I want to mention. Just a few days ago, I saw a report in the Wall Street Journal saying that actually, before the ceasefire, the United States and Israel, their next step is indeed to deliver a heavy blow to Iran's economy. That includes things like chemical plants and steel factories. Didn't Israel bomb one of their steel factories just a couple of days ago? That's their plan. But I think for those of us who come from authoritarian countries, we understand this quite well. That is to say, when you strike at the economy of an authoritarian regime, it actually doesn't bring down the regime itself. Everyone knows about the situation with the Chinese Communist Party, for example. During those 3 years of great famine, it was really so many people starved to death, yet the regime didn't collapse. So this is the point. It's as if Westerners, those who haven't lived under authoritarian regimes, in their thinking, in their mindset, they don't really understand this. I think economic sanctions, economic pressure. But there's one thing I'd also like to ask you. At the beginning of the year, in January, there was a massive protest in Iran. Huge crowds of people took to the streets. The origin of those protests was also because Iran's economy was in terrible shape at the time, with inflation skyrocketing. So could it also be because of this? Did this sequence of events lead Trump and his team to believe that targeting and crippling the Iranian economy could significantly weaken its regime and make it much more likely for the people to rise up and overthrow it? Is this the underlying strategy they are currently thinking?
They might be thinking that way, but don't forget, back in January, the entire Western world, or let's just say the democratic world, or simply the United States, the American public all believed, oh, now the Iranian people are rising up to overthrow this meant regime. Just like you said, that's not actually the case. They aren't overthrowing them from a political ideology standpoint. It's just that the Iranian regime is extremely corrupt, and they've been embezzling the country's assets to an outrageous degree. They use public funds for personal purposes, and a lot of investments can't be recovered. In the end, they just print money recklessly. Reckless money printing is basically the government robbing the people. The ordinary people are taking to the streets because of economic reasons. They just can't take it anymore. But if you draw the conclusion from this that the economy alone can bring down a regime, that might be wrong, because there are a few reasons here, namely, under what circumstances will a dictatorship collapse? In reality, it only happens when they are forced to give up the use of force. Their military must say, I can't fight the people anymore. If this doesn't happen, it's impossible. When we look at the Tiananmen incident in China, it was because the Communist Party stubbornly used the military to suppress the students. They dared to open fire, so he survived. In Eastern Europe, it was because Gorbachev of the Soviet Union said, I will not suppress you anymore. If the people in your Eastern European countries rebel, I will not send in troops. As a result, those regimes naturally collapsed, right? In Romania, they fought to the death, and after the army switched sides, the dictator was executed. So if the military continues to suppress the people, then truly the regime cannot be overthrown. Moreover, the U.S. military objective this time, its goal in the Iran operation, was, of course, influenced by Israel. In the end, the U.S. also started saying it wanted to eliminate Iran's nuclear capability and then to completely crush its military. Both of these objectives have basically been achieved, but now the U.S. has a certain feeling, which is, if you want to admit defeat, you have to make them surrender. So it's very... Well, if you don't send in ground troops, how could they possibly surrender? For example, there's a saying now that Iran has actually already been defeated, but it's still living in its own illusions, refusing to admit its failure. This idea is quite interesting. Let me give you an example. I was talking to someone else, and I said, imagine we're struggling in the water. I say, hey, you've already drowned, I've already won. But the other person says, I'm not dead yet. I say, you're dead, you just don't know it. So now the U.S. is saying the same thing to Iran's government. You're already dead, you just don't know it. But if someone is dead and can still talk to you, that means they're not actually dead. So Iran says, come on then. The truth is they still have real and effective control over society, using their authoritarian power and their guns to suppress the people. They're still ruling over you. If you don't show up with troops, sure, you can keep targeting the leaders. And as long as you know where those top figures are, you can kill them. But they have this theocracy over there. They believe they're acting on behalf of Allah, and every time a leader is taken out, another one steps up to replace him. And each new leader is even more extreme because they're directly confronting the U.S. and they're willing to risk everything.
Right. So now some people are saying that if the U.S. and Iran end up with this kind of negotiation result, if these 2 points can't be achieved, then it becomes very difficult. The first is that Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz must be neutralized. The second is that Iran absolutely must not continue developing its nuclear weapons capability. If these 2 points can't be met, then actually the outcome of the war would not be favorable for the United States. So what do you think about this kind of analysis?
Well, regarding the prospects of this Saturday's negotiations, or rather, let's look at the bargaining chips on both sides. What bargaining chips does the United States have? The U.S. chip is to use the most extreme military action to completely crush this country. Now, what does country mean? First, it's the economy and then society, of course. The United States will certainly try its best not to harm civilians, right? So it will target their infrastructure, military facilities, and civilian facilities. Right now, it's mainly infrastructure, roads, bridges, water sources, energy, and so on. Factories and these kinds of capabilities. In addition, like Israel, they might continue with decapitation strikes, making the leadership leave first. These are the bargaining chips the United States has. But what about these? As we saw earlier, the United States has already revealed these bargaining chips. However, the dictatorial members of Iran, they don't accept this, right? So what bargaining chips does Iran have? Iran's biggest bargaining chip is its control over the Strait of Hormuz, and they found this to be extremely effective. Because even Trump said, if you want to This kind of sabotage, basically disrupting shipping, is just too easy. He said, you just drive a truck and dump a whole truckload of naval mines into the water, and then it becomes difficult for ships to pass through. It doesn't take much effort or resources on their part. But think about how hard it is to protect against that. It's easy for them to cause damage, but protecting against it is not easy at all. So as long as they still have some missiles, some drones, and a few naval mines, and at the same time they can still unexpectedly shoot down an American plane, which is probably with missiles provided by Russia or China. Of course, so as for these things, in addition, their control over their own people is extremely brutal. They just open fire. They have an army, and when an organized army kills unorganized civilians, that's just too easy. So these are his bargaining chips. As for these chips, the U.S. is the big player and he doesn't have much he can do. So he can bomb nuclear facilities. If he sees your nuclear facilities, he'll bomb them. But even if he destroys all your nuclear facilities in the short term, if you want him to open up the Strait of Hormuz, he still won't do it. More importantly, as I just mentioned, the U.S. strategic objective has already changed. It's no longer just about eliminating their nuclear facilities and preventing them from having them. It's also about almost wiping out their military. Their conventional forces, Navy and Air Force, are basically gone. As for the Army, there's nothing you can do. The Army can hide. Unless you send in ground troops, you can't bomb them all. Yeah, and they can even disperse their forces into remote civilian areas. How are you supposed to bomb that? So, in this situation, the U.S. thinks that if they don't admit defeat, then you haven't really won. But for the U.S., that's a very hard goal to achieve. So in terms of bargaining chips, in the Saturday negotiations, they won't easily give up control of the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, from Trump's perspective, we also know that sometimes when Trump speaks, he says all sorts of things to confuse the enemy. He tries to mislead the enemy, and of course he also misleads us. We really don't know what he actually wants to do. One moment he says, hey, I want to team up with Iran to collect protection fees. Wow, when you say something like that, it really undermines the momentum we thought was needed to take down this dictatorship. It feels like he's lost his drive, right? So it turns out it's all about economic interests.
Right.
Taking all of this into account, I don't feel too optimistic about the negotiations on Saturday.
So actually, do you think that if we really want to solve the Iran issue, because you just said that America's goals have changed, in fact, I think America's goal from the very beginning implicitly included hoping for regime change in Iran for a change of government. Of course, on the surface, they didn't say it directly. They just said they wanted to eliminate Iran's nuclear capabilities, destroy its missiles, and so on. Destroy their navy or whatever. The problem is, if this regime doesn't change, it can restart its nuclear weapons development at any time, and it can resume its missile development whenever it wants. So if you really want to eliminate these threats, regime change is fundamental. But regarding regime change, do you mean that ground troops must be deployed? Is that what you mean? Only by deploying ground troops can there truly be a regime change.
This point is becoming increasingly clear to me. In the past, people still thought, based on the Venezuela case, that if you let the leader leave first, the regime would change. Of course, as we just discussed, Venezuela is much weaker in terms of military capability. You see, they even have to rely on Cuba, a small, weak, and struggling country, to protect them. Just imagine how dire their situation must be, right? In fact, even compared to a country as large as Iran, Venezuela still can't measure up. So it's impossible that just letting the leader leave would result in a regime change. Second, some say that attacking their infrastructure would lead to regime change, but now it's clear that's not possible either. Even if you bomb me back to the Stone Age, I could still rule my country like a caveman, unless you come and fight me to the end. But sending in ground troops for a life or death struggle, that's something only the United States would do. For decades, from the Korean War to the Vietnam War, over all these years, the painful lesson from those wars is the fear of getting bogged down, but if you don't do it, regime change becomes extremely difficult. In fact, the neighboring Gulf countries want regime change even more than the United States does. Why? Because they think once you've finished fighting and he's left without nuclear weapons and his military is basically dismantled, you just leave. He slowly rises again and starts harassing us, so we still can't have peace. We're right next to him while you're so far away. His missiles can't reach you, but if his missiles explode here, we have no way to deal with it. Now, if he attacks Europe, Europe can't do anything either. Europe gets scared and says, don't bomb me, I'm just like you, I'll say nice things to you. Exactly, so up until now, he still can't hit the United States. If one day he is able to strike the US, then the danger will be huge because technology. If you expect Iran to ever catch up with American technology, that's just wishful thinking. Why is that? Russia and China are helping them. Yes, both China and Russia have very strong technology themselves. China can steal and learn. When it comes to technology, the gap with the US is getting smaller and smaller, not bigger, because stealing and learning are much faster than original innovation. The US stays ahead through original innovation.
You mentioned China, because this time the media has widely reported, and Trump himself has admitted, that Iran was able to come to the negotiating table. In this process, the Chinese Communist Party played a mediating role. They went and, well, not exactly mediated, but they persuaded Iran and pushed Iran to sit down for negotiations. So why do you think the Chinese Communist Party would be willing to push Iran to the negotiating table?
Well, that's just one version of the story. We haven't confirmed it definitively because China never does anything openly. All right, so first, let's take a look at what interests the Chinese Communist Party has in this situation. Who is the Chinese Communist Party's biggest enemy? The CCP's biggest enemy is the United States. So if the US is weakened and drawn into this conflict, of course China would be happy to see that, right? That way, America's attention would be diverted over there. And if it suffers losses, the CCP would be left alone. There would be no way to contain China anymore, which is exactly what they want. So then, what about economically? Of course, the CCP relies on Iranian oil, and obviously economically, a rise in oil prices does have an impact on China. Moreover, Iran is, after all, a very important strategic partner for the CCP. Right? They also don't want to see Iran's regime actually changed. I think what the CCP fears most is a regime change in Iran, so they definitely want to support the current Iranian government, including at the United Nations. When neighboring countries proposed to unite to protect the security of the Strait of Hormuz, the CCP immediately said, hey, that's unfair to Iran. But what does that even mean, being fair to Iran? Iran is the one attacking tankers in the Gulf, right? So you can see it's obvious they're taking Iran's side. So, on the other hand, if you look at it from this perspective, in terms of concrete economic interests, on the US side, right now they are no longer mentioning restrictions on US military use of rare earth elements. They've stopped bringing it up. So the US should now be able to obtain rare earth products from China. These rare earth products are clearly used in US military jet fighters, in missiles, and in all kinds of military weapons. They all require them. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party has tacitly allowed it. In fact, you could even say they have indirectly supported the US in using these weapons against Iran. On the other hand, China has done even more for Iran, not only buying Iranian oil, which gives Iran foreign currency and allows its economy to survive, but also providing unlimited support in military technology and intelligence. They are definitely aiding Iran in these areas, and even Trump sensed this. Trump said, whoever supplies weapons to Iran, I'll impose an additional 50% or even 500% tariff on them. That statement was clearly directed at the Chinese Communist Party, right? Even though he didn't mention China by name. Who else could provide support? Russia might be able to give a little, but Russia can barely take care of itself right now. So the biggest supporter is definitely the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP doesn't send a single soldier, and they don't even show their hand, but behind the scenes, they are very effective in supporting both sides. They want to have it all. On the American side, I get you addicted to drugs and have you fight them. On the Tibetan side, I also fund you, so you fight them too. And then, if things don't work out, I can even put on the face of a mediator and say, let me help mediate for you. Trump even kept thanking them, as if the CCP's mediation was actually effective. So, Zhou Gong really took full advantage of the situation in there as well.